This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. Welcome to the podcast. I'm Jamie Bogner, co-founder and editorial director of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, and my guest today is Neil Fisher of WeldWerks. This episode is brought to you by craftbeer.com, home of the most powerful brewery locator in the universe. Whether you're traveling in a new city or planning your next beercation, head to craftbeer.com and explore the wide world of American craft beer. Want to support small and independent breweries? Look for the Independent Craft Brewer seal when you search. Neil, you guys put the Independent Craft Beer symbol on your packaging.
Yeah, it was funny. We were actually perusing. I think they had published an article or something, some feature on the seal, and we saw there was a Fruity Bits Pina Colada Crowler that had the seal on it. So I think we were one of the early ones as far as like the crowlers. So I put it on our crowlers, and now it's on our cans and ends up on our bottles too. So,
well, sure. Thank you for craftbeer.com sponsoring this episode, and thank you, Neil, for joining us on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Our history with Neil goes way back. Just to humor me for a minute here as we kind of recast this, because I also often get the question, why is WeldWerks all over Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine? And the story really goes back to our issue number 1, the very first issue of the magazine. And Neil is a local homebrewer and an award-winning homebrewer and a BJCP judge. And we put out a call to all the local homebrew clubs looking for BJCP certified judges. And Neil answered the call. So he and a bunch of other homebrewers in northern Colorado became our blind review panel. And so for years, I guess a full year before the brewery launched.
Yeah, it was a full year.
Yeah, Neil sat on our review panel and managed to challenge everyone else on the panel with his palate. There came to a point where we couldn't even announce in some of the categories what the beers were after we reviewed them, because through process of elimination, Neil would independently identify blindly what that beer was and then be able to guess what future ones might be. And so that was a moment where he knew Neil had some brewing skills here and a highly refined palate.
Yes.
Article about his basement barrel projects were in the very first issue of the magazine, and that played a part in you guys your pitch for funding for the brewery even.
Yep, we included that little that I don't know, 3-page article, some pictures of the basement. That was kind of at the end of our business plan and pitch to investors. It was all included there, so it was good to give us some credibility before we opened to have Craft Beer and Brewing article right there about barrel aging for homebrewers.
So we go way back. And it was really exciting for us to see Neil launch his brewery. That first year was an interesting kind of get feet under you kind of experience. But let's talk a little bit about where that change came, because after that first year, you launched with some pretty standard beers. You had your brown ale, you had your Hefeweizen, you had a West Coast IPA that was pretty standard West Coast IPA, not a bad beer, but just pretty normal.
Yeah, we had kind of the basic formula that I think almost 75% of breweries 2, 3, even 5 years ago opened with. You need an IPA, you need a wheat, you need something malty, and you need something kind of in the middle. And so that was kind of where our lineup started. And we just happened to have success with the Hefeweizen. So that was kind of luck that we chose a style that, 1, was popular, but also 2, that we were proficient at brewing. And so but then since then we've pivoted in lots of different directions, and now we're probably known more for New England style IPA and adjunct stouts.
So now you're canning and selling 4-packs straight out of the brewery, and
very different model.
barrel aged releases again on ticketed type of sales. And there was that moment around that first anniversary, and I remember it well because we were here for that first anniversary brunch, where all of a sudden you had this new beer called Juicy Bits. And that seemed to be, and at the same time, or shortly after, the Medianoche barrel-aged beers.
Yeah.
And that moment, that 1 year point, seemed to be kind of a pivotal moment for the brewery that kind of kick-started this much more fast growth phase.
Yeah, I think it's really equally Juicy Bits and Medianoche. Medianoche had been in the tanks since we opened, so we knew we were making a barrel-aged stout. Obviously from my homebrew background, that was kind of what I loved focusing on. And So we built our barrel program, or started our barrel program pretty much the week we opened the tap room. So we got beer into barrels right away. So at our 1 year anniversary, we finally had Medianoche ready. But at the same time, we decided, hey, why not try this, this hazy looking New England style IPA that you in particular, you and my buddy Adam had been really kind of pushing, like, hey, you guys should really try this really softer bitterness. And I think for a long time, I had, obviously had the Alchemist stuff and even these things, the Treehouse Trilliums that were out, coming out pretty popular at the time. I hadn't had a lot of those. So I think exposure from you and Adam and other friends just saying, hey, these are different beers. These are very different than your average IPA. I was pretty sold after a few of those and just seeing how unique they were. So we wanted. It was
pure selfishness on my part, just wanting to have a local brewery making making a really nice, soft, hazy New England style IPA.
Yeah, I think if it weren't for you and Adam, we probably would never have even tried it. But I think, I think both.
Great, other brewers are going to now blame me in part for this.
Yep. Jamie and Adam, they probably get co-billing for Juicy Bits. But yeah, I think we obviously pivoted at that point. We didn't really anticipate that style in particular, IPA, New England style IPA, to be our linchpin for growth along with barrel-aged stouts. I mean, we knew we wanted to focus on barrel-aged stouts. We didn't really know how we'd compete in the market or how our beer would be kind of received compared to some of the best. And obviously since then, now, winning a gold at GABF means we're doing something right. So, we're still making some classic styles. We've done, a Grisette, a Hef. We kept the Hef on, but we've done some other wheat beers. We've done some Pilsners and other lagers. And I think even this year we're focusing a bit more on some basic styles that we may have lost in the last year. So, obviously the first year we started off with a very approachable lineup. And then the last, the second year we were much more on that ambitious side. And then this year we're kind of bringing in both.
So it's one thing to say, hey, let's make a hazy IPA. And there's a lot of breweries out there doing that. It's another thing to make a hazy IPA that captures, that is so clean and balanced, that has such a distinct point of view, that is really clear and has a very specific intent to it. How did you go through and tell me about that formative process for something like Juicy Bits, and how you decided what you wanted it to be and how you executed to get it there?
Yeah, I mean, we obviously tried a bunch. We probably spent, I think it was maybe in earnest, October maybe, that we really tried to track down as many of those examples as we could from any producer, not just the New England area, but anyone in the U.S. making a hazy or, whatever you want to call the style, a softer, juicier IPA. So we tried, I would say...
This is what, 2015?
It had been the end of 2014, or end of 2015, coming into 2016. So obviously it's a very different landscape now.
It seems so long ago.
It does seem,
it's, what, 2 years?
2 years, and we are now seeing it's the biggest style in the country by far, I think. And, that was kind of the discussion at the end of last year. Now this year, it's not even a question of, it's just, how long does it last, I think. So yeah, we probably tried 20, 25 examples and got a really good understanding of a little bit of the style itself, what makes it unique, what makes it special, what makes it different than your average West Coast IPA or even just, East Coast IPA. And once we understood that, we knew we didn't want to just clone a beer. If I could, or if we wanted to, we would have just tried to clone, Julius is one of my favorites. I think it was just a really well executed
Julius
version.
From Treehouse Brewing.
Yep. I think that was probably the beer that for me was the turning point. That was just a fantastic beer. I think Nate and the team at Treehouse have just done a great job dialing in those IPAs. So, I mean, they're for us a huge influence, but we didn't want to make that. We didn't want to make Trillium's beers. We didn't want to make, even some of the others that we'd been trying from Other Hands and Tired Hands and Other Half. So we didn't want to just make another, copy of someone else's beer. I think that's why we like this style so much. Everyone has a perspective. Some of those perspectives aren't as clear, and I think that's where we saw an opportunity for us to have a bit more of a distinguishing voice in the crowded marketplace that was, IPA. There was New England style IPA, which is not nearly as crowded, but I think even there we saw an opportunity to bring in a little bit less bitterness, maybe even more hops. So I think our hop rates are probably on the higher end of the average at, probably 5 to 7 pounds per barrel is our average hop usage on New England style IPAs. Not just for excess, but because of the way we make them, we really, really load those in the whirlpool and dry hop, and very little, if any. Mostly none of our beers have kettle additions. So it really relies more on the hop character. And so to balance it, even though we don't have the bitterness to balance, we have this massive hop character. And that's kind of the MO we started with, and also more fruit forward. It's definitely, the name is kind of, indicative of the flavor, a little bit more of that juice, orange juice, pineapple juice, tropical fruit juice. That's kind of what we're going for.
And you've even tailored the malt bill so that it has that tinge of orange color to it.
Yep, we definitely dialed in the color. Obviously, with the kind of turbidity and the opaqueness, there's some, you have to factor that into when the finished product, what it looks like, because when you're mashing, it's going to be different than when you have a bunch of, polyphenol haze or hop haze or even a little bit of yeast or whatever is causing all that haze. It changes the appearance. So we've definitely dialed it in. Before it was almost a little lighter, and just didn't have quite as much of that like orange juice looking kind of appearance. So we kind of like that both for the flavor and for the appearance of our beer. We obviously venture away a little bit from that Juicy Bits prototype. We've done a lot of variants of Juicy Bits, but we've also done a lot of beers like Space Cowboy we're releasing tomorrow is a very different take on still a WeldWerks IPA, but it's not. I wouldn't say it's a Bits-inspired variation.
I'm drinking one now. It's fantastic.
Yeah. It's always fun to get to use
Galaxy.
Galaxy.
Yeah.
Galaxy is kind of the home run all the time. But it was fun knowing that we were going to use Galaxy. How can we give it a different... we've done Galaxy DDH Juicy Bits, which is a different beer than this, too. So, yeah, I think I'm most proud of for what we've done. I think we do a really good job executing IPAs. But like you said, we're proud of the fact that we do have a little bit of a different kind of vantage point that we're trying to present. So
as you were going through and kind of working through these ideas, what was your process? How do you reverse engineer this? How do you figure out, because at the time there weren't a lot of resources out there. Folks that were making these beers, they made them their way, but they weren't necessarily telling folks what they were doing and giving other people a roadmap to make their own.
No.
So figuring out yeast usage, figuring out water chemistry, figuring out the hopping methods, when to add hops, dry hop regimens. I mean, that was still the Wild West back then, and you had to do a lot of testing, a lot of trial and error.
Yeah, we did. Honestly, we didn't even get to do as much testing as we did just more research. I think we didn't do the first batch of Juicy Bits was the one we poured at our 1-year anniversary. So there was no pilot batch. We had a pilot system at the time, but we didn't have the time to run it. And so it was a 15-barrel test batch. And I don't think we did a 30-barrel for the first one, but we had just done. Really, the research we did was mostly.
Are you kidding me? That was the first.
That was the the one we poured at the anniversary was the
brewers everywhere really hating you right now.
Well, but to be honest, that research started in October, November. So from October, November till March of 2016, if we were smarter and had more time, we probably would have spent that time brewing test batches. But we were more focused on the understanding. But we did. Honestly, most of it was homebrew forums, or that was the majority of the discussions about making these styles was on the homebrew. So whether it was, forum here or there, or Facebook group or something, that's where the majority of the discussion was happening at the time about water chemistry. But then we even extrapolated it away from that style and understanding, like even haze stability was a huge component for us because we've suffered from batches going clear. We had that happen. We dropped bright. It's a terrible problem to have.
It doesn't taste the same if it's not hazy.
Of course not. So that's anecdotal whether it's different or not. But
so what did you settle on in terms of how do you maintain that kind of haze? And I think there's a common misconception with New England style IPAs that they're just full of yeast and that yeast is providing the haze, but you're actively trying to pull all the yeast out of those beers.
If it were up to us, we would have 0 cells per milliliter in yeast counts in all of our finished IPAs. It's a lot harder to do that here when we don't have a centrifuge or some other equipment that would make that easier. But that does mean we cold condition a little bit longer. We are very especially in the fermenter, we're very intentional about dropping that, flocking as much of the yeast out before it moves on to the either the last round of dry hops or even into the bright, and it means extended conditioning time. So we've had beers from breweries that are packaging them in 10 days, and they're great, but they're different. And we just have decided for both haze stability, flavor stability, and just overall drinking experience, we like a little bit longer conditioning time to drop as much yeast as possible, but relying more on mostly the protein and especially hop polyphenols for the haze. So I would say 75% of our, if not more, of the haze in our IPAs is derived either from the protein or hops, and not necessarily from the yeast.
So what do you do to lock that in?
Here we've done, so Alpha Bits is a beer we brew with Sleeping Giant. They're a contract brewery in Denver, and they have a centrifuge, which has made the process a little easier with them. So we've been able to, using a centrifuge, we've been able to basically change the speed we run the centrifuge at for the tank versus the cone. So we'll run the cone separate from the tank, the rest of the tank, knowing that the majority of the yeast is in that cone. So we'll run that at a speed that basically drops more out, knowing that the majority of the solids are yeast in that part of the tank. And then we'll basically blend that back with the second run of the rest of the tank with the centrifuge to a target turbidity. And then the last 2 cans we did of those, they were at I think a cell count was 0 cells per milliliter in the can. So literally no yeast in the can, but still fairly hazy. Not nearly as turbid as some of the ones we've done. And just by nature of, when you're doing that big a batch and you're centrifuging, you're going to drop some more out. But it was much more stable. Here at the brewery, we really focus on flocking the yeast and harvesting it for the next batch, so we are able to reuse it, which presents a challenge when you're dry hopping early. But we're just very intentional about making sure we flock as much yeast as we can before our second and third dry hop. Usually the first one we can't flock because it's still active fermentation. But we've done a lot to try and just understand how this yeast works. It's the London Ale 3 1318.
Yeah.
And it's not a super aggressive flocker, but it will flock under the right conditions. And even just knowing when to spun the tank and close valves and build up a little bit of head pressure just triggers a little bit quicker flock. Just dropping even a degree or 2 kind of lets it know once you're past VDK rests and everything, hey, it's time to move on. We're making room for hops, and I think we've just kind of gotten to understand this yeast strain a lot more. Whereas first few batches we would have a lot more clumping, a lot more settling in the cans or crowlers or bottles or whatever, or I guess growlers, never growlers but always crowlers for juicy bits. But we I think now we understand better a little bit of how we can keep it more stable in the can. And I don't know that we can even definitively say that haze makes a huge impact on either mouthfeel, hop character, but we know just, aesthetically when we drink it, it's a different experience. So consumers are the same way. So can't fault anybody for wanting it to appear aesthetically one way, but it's also not our goal. So it's just kind of a part of the process. But I do think if that's going to be a part of your process, ensuring better haze stability and rather than clumping in the cans and sometimes that's unavoidable, but if you can avoid it, I think just everyone's going to pour it into a glass at some point. So the less floaties, the less kind of solid clumps you have coming out, the better kind of experience you're going to have on the consumer side.
For sure. It's a funny thing where better looking now means solidly hazy.
Yeah, uniform.
But without those clumps.
Yeah. Exactly.
You mentioned a second ago your first dry hop happening before your yeast flocks out, which tells me you're dry hopping before you hit a terminal gravity. Biotransformation, certainly a big buzzword. I imagine you've tried it both ways. What's the difference that you get out of dry hopping before you've reached terminal gravity while that yeast is still active versus the more traditional process of waiting until after you've already hit that gravity?
I think in the professional beer community right now, I think hops are one of the things that we're trying to understand more of. It seems like that's the top of everyone's list right now is research, especially dry hopping rates at where we're at now. We've seen some new papers that are pretty groundbreaking on dry hop bitterness, even dry hop attenuation. And I know Allagash and Jason worked with OSU to do that study on basically increased attenuation from dry hopping. They've discovered it was enzymes that were an additional enzyme kind of charge that would help even attenuate like Coors Light. They were dry hopping finished or maybe Coors, I can't remember which lager it was, but some very, very stable terminal gravity lager and just a small dry hop, and then they were able to re-ferment almost a full, I think, half Plato down.
Wow.
So it was, and so I think Allagash noticed that in white. I think especially they were seeing these diacetyl blooms in some bottles and things, and so they led that study. And I think that was just the tip of the iceberg. Now I think the next big topic beyond just dry hop bitterness, and we're talking about IBUs now a lot more, and whether they're relevant, which in my opinion, not right now the way we measure them, but how can we figure out a better metric? I think the next thing is biotransformation, because I don't think anyone has done any analytical study on biotransformation to give any quantitative data, to give anything that's definitive, like, yes, this is happening. So, I mean, I think there's definitely
anecdotally speaking,
and I think I would say that, I'm still in the camp of uncertainty. I do think it makes a difference based on just your mechanical action. You've got more hops moving around, and you're in an oxygen deprivant environment too. That's the other benefit to doing it then versus post fermentation. Every time you dry hop, you're going to add some oxygen. So I think that is a big factor too, that you got a little bit of fermentation still happening, so you're not quite scrubbing all the aromatics, but you're keeping those hops mostly in solution, so you're getting pretty good extraction that way. You're also doing it under very, very little oxygen, and eventually that oxygen is getting scrubbed out anyway. So I think that gives you that brighter hop character. But we do notice, especially Citra, we notice if we do everything terminal versus during fermentation, that Citra addition just goes from like a really nice kind of grapefruity to this more tangerine, sweeter, almost candy-like hop character. And so that's anecdotally for me, I say that maybe there's some other biotransformation happening with the yeast. We don't have definitive data yet, but I even think it's varietal specific. I think certain varietals are interact with yeast different than others. I've noticed a bigger change in Citra than I have in our Mosaic. I don't see a lot of difference in the mid dry hop fermentation. Just the difference in the character we're pulling out versus the post fermentation. I don't get as much of that almost transformative character as I do in the Citra. So I wish I knew more about what was at work, but I do think that for New England style IPAs in particular, it seems like that's a pretty big common practice, is to do early to mid dry hop or fermentation dry hop additions. And I think that is kind of a little bit of why we're seeing a difference in character in these beers. So I think it's even a little bit less vegetal, maybe because it has a little bit more time. Those late dry hop additions, especially like a day or two before you're moving on to packaging or anything, those I think can be a little bit harsher. Same reason first wort hopping is a little different. It's just a little bit more time for those to either change or soften. You have a little bit more conditioning time after the fact as well. So.
Have you tried pitching with your yeast and or dry hopping with your yeast pitch?
We did. We did a 0 bits, which was kind of we did a seminar up at Big Beers with New Belgium and Cerebral and Outer Range, and just basically to understand more about this dry hop bitterness phenomenon we're all seeing of actually adding stable bitterness to a beer just from dry hops, no isomerization. And so with that beer, we moved the entire dry hop whirlpool load into the fermenter. So we did nothing in the hot side, no hops in the first wort, no hops at whirlpool. Everything was in the fermenter after we were already at knockout temp. So we actually filled the fermenter before we knocked out into it. We filled it with that entire 20 to 30 or actually probably 40 pound load of hops that we normally use in the whirlpool. And so it fermented the entire time with it. Unfortunately, we don't have that beer on tap anymore, but it was a really fun experiment to see not just the no bitterness.
I had some last week.
Yeah. So I think we just kicked it this week. But it was fun to see just the difference in the hop character from that kind of, and that's a lot of interaction, probably a lot of scrubbing too.
Did you all run any kind of sensory testing to see what folks might have in a blind way perceived the IBU load to be on that?
We did a little bit. We did it with a small group of us, and then I think New Belgium might have even done some too with their sensory. And the guesses were all much lower than Juicy Bits, but still well above what we expected. Closer to 40 IBUs was about what everyone's kind of sensory guesses were. And the test that came back with from New Belgium, they did both isomerized and basically total alpha acid or total alpha bitterness. Was around 75 IBUs to 80 IBUs. And that was based on, they did both mass spectrophotometry, mass spec testing, and then they also did HPLC or QPLC to basically get an idea of what the, two different tests, one for isomerized, which surprisingly came back at almost 5 IBUs of isomerized alpha acid bitterness.
Even though there was no heat at all.
No, yeah, we're
Wow.
I think Ross at New Belgium is still trying to figure that one out because they saw the same thing on their tests and trials. Yeah. Our two guesses are either was a sensor or is the prepping the samples, maybe enough heat in that process, or which is more likely is the actual pelletization process. Imparts enough heat for isomerization. So, that alone, that study right there could tell you you can add 5 IBUs of bitterness without of isomerized alpha acid bitterness just by dry hopping. The fact that we don't know that, we don't know why, tells you that we're really on the cusp of understanding hops a lot more in the next decade than we do now.
Yeah. Well, and it's a fun thing not knowing everything about what's happening, because it gives us more space to move in, and more things to understand. No, that's absolutely fascinating.
Yeah,
Fascinating.
the small things for me in that study were what I'm super excited about. Like, where are we going to go from here on how we communicate bitterness to, consumers? We removed IBUs from every single beer. We even
Really?
deleted them from beers that we had kind of guessed on before, because we realized it's now more about balance. And so even a technically 100 IBU beer can still taste like 40 to 50 IBUs if you've balanced it with
Sure.
Malt character and backbone. And I think that's where the New England style really distinguishes itself. It's really not bitterness focused, but it's balance focused. And whether it is a more bitter example or a less bitter example like ours, they're both very, very balanced compared to your average West Coast palate wrecking bitter.
No, that's a fantastic point, that our perception of beer does not necessarily track to the metrics that beer tests out at.
Right.
That that if a brewer is doing their job, then that extra residual sweetness that might be in a beer could counteract some of that bitterness, and some of that body, some of other characteristics of the beer, and there's no real way to quantify what that sensory impact is, other than to trust the brewer is not going to beat you over the head with something insane, unless they tell you that it's absolutely insane.
Yeah, and I think that's where we're in a tough point now. I understand why consumers want to know IBUs, but what they don't realize is that the IBUs, even for a classic West Coast style, are no longer relevant, because we're seeing dry hop rates that are so high that we're the other interesting thing about these papers is you can actually knock isomerized alpha acids out of solution from dry hopping. So you can actually bring IBUs that were technically stable and drop them. So at certain dry hop rates, you can bring your bitterness down, and at higher ones, you can replace all those or even add oxidized alpha acids. So even a beer that's typically at 75 IBUs is dry hopped, moderately, will actually come down to closer to 60. So I think we're just using
There's a great article about that in Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, last year's IPA issue, written by Stan Hieronymus. Stan, quick plug.
Yeah, Stan's got some. I think a lot of that is what we're seeing now, is that even breweries that aren't doing New England style are going to benefit from some of the research. I know Modern Times is a big leader in that. They're one of probably the biggest producers of the style until now we've got New Belgium's got a version out. I know Sierra Nevada's got a version out. So hopefully, as more of these bigger breweries kind of take on the style, we'll see some better actual data. So I'm excited. I think we're really on the, it sounds like, such a cliche, like we're on the next frontier of hops, but we really are, I think, on a better understanding. It's not going to change a whole lot of what we do, but we'll better understand it, so help us improve our beers.
Well, I think that's a good thing for consumers to understand. One, they only care about IBUs because the industry told them they should care about IBUs, and so we can, let's change the way we talk about that kind of thing, and we'll change what consumers care about. The other piece is that you're right. We are on the cusp of what's happening in hops and understanding this really, key raw ingredient. If you look back, 6 or 7 years, hops like Citra were just a blip on the new radar that very few people were using them, and somehow we've gone from that kind of blip to now 2017 crop where over 6 million pounds of Citra was harvested. That's an amazing spin up for a hop like that in the course of 5 or 6 years. Just absolutely incredible. And if you go back to that kind of 2010 time period, also the number of brewers that were actively engaged with hops growers was incredibly small. You go. I was out in Yakima last year talking to some of them. Back in 2010, the number of brewers that came out to walk the fields, to do hop selection. You were talking about less than 100, total people coming out for that. And now it's well into the several thousands.
Oh, man.
And every brewer that could possibly do it. In fact, my number of hundreds might even be high. It was probably less than 50 brewers that would go out at the time and do that. Really just the big guys, the biggest folks that would send their folks out there. And now every brewer, as soon as they possibly can hit the thresholds that the major growers and brokers put out there for going out to do hop selection, they're there in a heartbeat, because having that kind of engagement with the raw materials and being able to select through those materials right then and there. It's an incredibly powerful thing. And you just went out last year for your first hop selection, right?
Yeah, it was an amazing experience, and I think, like you said, it was the fact. I think the brokers have brought that minimum down to make it a bit more approachable for small breweries.
I saw that one of the brokers in particular has now brought that minimum down to like anything you order, so like 200 pounds or something. Yeah,
which is crazy, but I think it does, like you said, it gives you that next level of kind of hands-on and really that next level of distinction from, not all Citra is equal. I think that's what we've realized too, even just now starting to use our 2017 crop from Citra, Mosaic, Eldorado, a couple others we've got on contract that we've selected. Our Citra this year is just drastically different than what we were using last year. And, it's I think it's better, but it's also different. So we were able to even go out, even knowing what our profile is, knowing, it's a lot easier for us now knowing the direction we're going with our IPAs, which are much more fruit forward and a lot more, we're not looking for as much just huge, just bitterness and kind of even hop, assertiveness. We're looking for more fruit complexity in those hops, and we're looking for almost juiciness. And so it was fun to go out and try, and I really love this Citra. It's amazing. Got a really nice kind of dankness to it, a little bit more of like a bit of grounding, not just tropical fruit, not just citrus, but we want more just tropical fruit and citrus for what we're doing at WeldWerks. So it was cool to be able to select that lot, and now we're seeing how that's impacted our beer. We did a Citra basic bits, we did a Citra DDH juicy bits that both use that new crop year, and it's just made given us a little bit more competitive edge, I think, in the marketplace to have our own lot selected based on the SKUs we want to make. Gives us one more layer of kind of intentionality in the way we design recipes.
One of the benefits you have as a small brewer is that you can, opposed to a larger brewer that's trying to maintain brand standards and an expectation for that recipe as it initially stood, is that you can quickly pivot like that. And if you want to make juicy bits with your new Citra crop that might not be exactly like the old one, but it gives you more of what you really want out of it, you can do that. Or you can just make new beers out of it and and roll out a new thing. And that's a challenge that some of the bigger brewers actually face. That and I want to talk to Wayne from Cigar City. He was talking about that. Like when we go to hop selection, we're looking for a very specific character, for this hop, and others might actually taste or smell better or more exciting or more interesting, but we need this in order for it to be just like the beer that we made before.
Right.
And there's, when you were talking about large scale production and expectation for consumers, that's certainly a thing.
Right.
But when you're a brewery your size, you certainly can also get people excited about the potential change in that.
Yeah, and I mean we've even learned to use that to our advantage, and we did a lot of new beers last year. We have plans this year is the goal is 100 new beers, 100 new SKUs for 2018, which is we're a month in now, and we did I think 9 or 10 new beers this month already. But it's fun because I think, like you said, we have that kind of pivot ability, we got that flexibility, we've got the agility to be able to, okay, we're going to do this one beer that we may make again, we may not, but we can bring in a really exciting one-off hop, or we can use our current hop and complement it with something else, or it gives us a lot of flexibility. It does present a lot of challenges. It's its own set of challenges, but from not just the production side, but also the sales side, trying to build a portfolio of rotators and seasonals and one-offs. And I know that we're part of the problem of creating more and more seasonals and rotators and one-offs, which the industry has mixed feelings on.
Is it a problem though? I think from a business perspective, certain folks in the business who want it to operate the way it's always operated may look at that as a problem. And fair enough,
Right.
Compared to the way it's always been and what that business as usual is, yes, that's different. The stores have a harder time adapting to that. The sales processes, the historical sales processes of reps and handles and whatnot have a harder time dealing with that. But if you look at it from a consumer perspective, your consumers, those that are attracted to craft beer, the people that like to buy your beer, they like those new experiences. Those new experiences are one of the reasons that they get attracted to a brewery, and one of the reasons they keep coming back and buying beer over and over again, because they want some sort of new and exciting experience. And so in some ways, if you hate on that, you are hating on the entire mentality of craft beer consumers that led them to the sector in the first place.
Yeah, I think if you're looking at it strictly from a consumer's perspective, it's absolutely great. It's as long as the breweries can execute on that. That's I think the real challenge is that a lot of breweries do struggle to bring in, 4 new beers every 2 months because they're just not doing the consistency. That's been a challenge for us. If we do a one-off, we basically have one chance to make it good, and we don't have 2 or 3 or 4 versions to get it better. But that just really means overall we just need to be better at brewing everything, not just one style. But obviously it translates. The more we know about Juicy Bits, the easier it is to make Space Cowboy. We understand a lot more about our system, about the way we design recipes. So we're incorporating all that knowledge we're gaining from a beer like Juicy Bits that we're on, batch 80 or something like that, something crazy. And we incorporate all that knowledge into the next batch we do. So, the one-off we do this month is good, and it might even, the next one-off might even be better because it benefits from what we learned in this one. So, I think from, like you said, consumers, if you really look at a consumer's perspective, yeah, absolutely, it's exciting. That's why I think craft beer is challenged big beer, because it's exciting and different. So I think you're right. There's, from the business perspective and from like a bigger brewery perspective especially, this is not a really fun model to go after 100 new SKUs in a year. But as a brewery like us, it's fun for our guys too. I mean, every week is something different, and we'll always get we get people all the time calling us out for being gimmicky, which is totally understandable. I don't begrudge that.
You play into that a little bit too.
Absolutely, for sure. We lean into it, but we also, I think we always come back to intentionality. So if we're going to do it, we want to make sure it's intentional. But it also means it's a fun place to work. It's a fun place to brew, because this week we might be making a Keller Pils, or we might be doing, something very classic. We're bringing back Steam Barrel. We're doing a West Coast style tomorrow, actually. We're brewing Steam Barrel 3.0, and bringing that one back. But then next week, I think we're doing a tiramisu blonde stout. So I've got a bunch of ladyfingers en route, and cocoa powder, espresso. What else? Even I think we're using condensed milk in this one. So going beyond it's lactose 2.0, I guess.
It's full pastry, huh?
Full on pastry.
Yeah. Would you bring up a good point, and I think that's the counterpoint to what I just said. As much as consumers want a new experience all the time, there's no denying that brewers get better at brewing a beer the more times that they make it.
Definitely.
And this is why, core brands for most brewers tend to be more well executed, more technically proficient, more spot on, and that, the more times you iterate, the more, things you learn about brewing that beer, and the better you get at it. And that's why some of the big macro beers are absolutely as precise and consistent and well crafted as they are, because when you make that beer for decades, you get really, really good at making that one beer. And the counterpoint to that is the one-off collaborations, which get exciting from a marketing perspective, can sometimes be some of the most disappointing beers that a brewery might make, because it's the first time they've brewed it, they're brewing something different, they're combining two different ideas together, and so you don't always end up with something as successful as it could be. But what you said resonates with me, that idea of creating new beers that are based on other beers, so that you're not reinventing the wheel every time. You are creating a new experience, but you're building it off of a base that you've already iterated on, and you've already built some development towards. And so it's not reinventing the wheel every time. It's changing some things and changing some ingredients and trying some new hops or something, but still building on that same kind of base.
Yeah, if we were trying to, just brand new style we've never done every single week, that I think would not necessarily work. I think even as a small brewery, you have to have some basis for, like you said, just getting better at a single way of making it or a single style. Like even our blonde stout, we did one blonde stout so far, and we didn't want to commit to doing a bunch more, but we had a lot of ideas that just work better in a lighter style than they would a dark stout. There are some lighter pastries that we want to really, we're talking tiramisu, we're talking, baklava, all these things that are really not chocolatey at all. So we needed a prototype. So that was the white chocolate cinnamon chai latte we did. And that was not even pastry, but more, coffee shop. But now that we have that kind of base that I thought was really well executed, we know now how we can, how can we bring in these other flavors, but we have a starting point. And so the next blonde stout will probably be even better executed than the last one. And then, keep going on. Even though the beers are changing, there's something, I think, core to that, of even just the basic understanding of how to make it, that if you're just starting from scratch every time, I think it's going to be tough to get really good at making beer.
Let's talk about these pastry beers for a moment, because depending on who you talk to, they're either it's the end of craft beer or it's the most exciting thing going. What brought you to it, and what do you think it is about the nature of these dessert beers, these beers that are based on culinary flavors that resonate with consumers and make them so exciting to people? Because undoubtedly, I mean, people buy a lot of these beers.
Yeah, I mean, it's not quite as, I don't think it's quite at the level of fervor that the New England style IPAs are, but it's not far behind. It's definitely I mean, it's almost become its own style. I think don't drink beer probably is the main culprit for growing the popularity within the brewing community. I think it was almost, that's how we saw it. We saw the pastry stout hashtag.
So just making fun of it has made it more popular.
Absolutely. For me, at least, I love championing something that everyone, like something really, like the Patriots. Everyone hates the Patriots. I'm kind of a Patriots fan this weekend because I love that. I mean, obviously a lot of people love them too. But if you tell me you hate something, I want to go and like it.
I'm betting on the Patriots.
Yeah.
I can't say I'm a fan.
Yeah, I think Tom Brady's going to get another ring. But I think for me it was just as unique. I think it went from. I mean, there's certainly an air of a potential for gimmick, and I don't even like the term gimmick. It's more fun. Like, okay, does everything have to be extremely, relevant to the beer? Like, does adding sugar cones to the mash tun really impart a lot of flavor in the finished product? Probably not a whole lot. If we're being completely honest, Choco Taco Stout was a really fun beer to make, but I don't think the 200 sugar cones we added to the mash tun really translated a lot into the can.
Yeah.
But it was the intentionality of, like, we want to make
a great Instagram picture.
Great Instagram. We did get some don't drink beer. I think
hate which is love.
Yeah, I think any press is good press for sure. But I think honestly, for us, why we latched onto it and really focused on it is because we've always used adjuncts. Even our very first, one of our first beers we opened with was our coffee stout. One of 4 beers we opened with. We didn't open with a regular stout. So I've always been drawn to adjuncts and how you can enhance brewing that way. But pastry stouts almost border beyond that, and what happens when you bring in a bunch of other things that you're not used to using, and how does that impact your flavor? Lactose is one thing. What about condensed milk? That's a whole different challenge that we're trying to face. Or what happens when we're doing an espresso beer, but we're doing it in a very, very lighter way than we've done in the past, and we're almost looking at, do we do an espresso finish in the keg? Just a powder instead of on the beans, something that could integrate over time but not necessarily extract as much. Or if we're even talking white chocolate, we add a bunch of white chocolate to the boil, are we seeing that in the finished flavor? A lot of it we don't know. We'll guess and check. But I like the intent. I like the intentionality of experience. I think that's what I like most about pastry stouts. When you say baklava, or you say tiramisu, or you say Black Forest cake, those people know those desserts. They know they have probably a childhood memory attached to that. Choco Taco is the same way. Running around in the summer, finding the ice cream truck that has Choco Tacos, and with your friends, everyone has something that ties them to food. I think especially, and so to tie that to something as fun as dessert, why not? I think for us, it's always, if we're going to call it something like a Black Forest cake stout, which we're releasing for Valentine's, we want to make sure it has a lot of chocolate and a lot of cherry, and so that bringing those two together, we could call a lot of different things, but why not bring it into that more culinary kind of chef experience, or even pastry experience, instead of it's just a cherry chocolate stout.
Now, there's always a danger in that, though. If it because consumers, as they buy that beer, have an expectation that if you call it German chocolate cake stout, that it's gonna have those flavors in it.
Sure.
If they taste it and it's like, oh, this doesn't taste like German chocolate, cake, then you're setting yourself up for some pretty harsh Untapped reviews.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, that's even French toast and some of the others we've done. We have to make sure, some of them we start off saying they're going to be X pastry, and really it's more like this pastry, and so we end up changing the name. And if we call out an ingredient, it's usually because we can pick it up. Even if I guess allergies are another reason why you'd call out an ingredient. But if we say we used cinnamon and you can't really get any cinnamon, probably just leave that off the descriptor. I mean,
even if you did use it.
Even if you used it, I don't know why you'd put that in there. Because like you said, as a consumer,
yeah.
I mean, even as a beer judge, you do that. At GABF, I remember having some really good adjunct beers, whether it was, I think we did a spice or vegetable, really, really good ingredient call-outs, and then really bad ones. I don't get any of this that you mentioned. And as the brewer, if it's not there, then why tell people it's there? I mean, you could say that in maybe the longer description, but if the short one-sentence line about the beer says that you used, X ingredient, and I can't pick it up, there's going to be disappointment from the consumer's perspective. So
no, for sure. I've always said this, and I've tried to coach this in seminars that I've led in our Brewery Accelerator events. But the power of suggestion that brewers have is really strong. And it's absolutely amazing if you triangulate against the way that brewers write descriptions for their beers, and then you read the reviews in aggregate of what people say about those beers, what you put on the label, what you put out there in your social media, and what you suggest to people that they're going to taste in that beer plays a very significant role in what they actually taste in that beer.
Definitely.
And so there is a very strong correlation between that. And so by naming a beer that way, you're implanting that correlation for people and building what would hopefully be a positive correlation between what that expectation is and what it tastes like, and giving them a language for talking about what it is that they're experiencing, because a lot of beer consumers don't necessarily have the same articulated palates that your average BJCP or competition judge has, and they can appreciate the fact that you guide them along and give them some of this language to talk about that kind of thing.
Right. Yeah, I think we want to make sure that we are helping the consumer better understand why our beer is unique, and so that really I think starts the description. So naming is I think a big part of that too. So pastry stouts, if they don't taste like like you said, if they don't taste like the whatever you're describing it as, there's going to be not just confusion but also disappointment. So
for sure. Well, let's talk about speaking of disappointments.
Yeah, speaking of disappointment,
there's another topic that for you as a small brewery you've had to deal with, and that's the challenge of having some barrel aged beers that you've produced come out and develop and express infections after packaging.
Right.
Despite some of your best efforts to test and verify that the spoilers weren't present in any kind of way after packaging. You've had these things happen, and it first happened with your barrel-aged Mexican achromatic stout, and you thought that was the end of it and went through it, and then it happened again with the Medianoche Reserve, and then most recently also happened again with Vanilla Medianoche release. That has to be a difficult thing for you to deal with.
Yeah, we let's see. So we've had Medianoche, available to the market since I guess our 1 year anniversary. So we're really not even coming up on 2 years of our barrel program, and not a ton of public releases. We've done a lot of volume, a lot of draft, and some crowler releases that obviously we didn't have a lot. Nobody was claiming we had any infections in those, but they're also crowlers. And then moving into the bottles, our first 2 bottle releases were perfect. Coconut Medianoche from, was it 2016, and then Vanilla Medianoche. Those bottles, I think people still open every once in a while.
I don't mean to make you defensive about this, but
no, I'm saying I'm saying we had those 2,
right.
And then we move into now I think the last 3 since then where we've had issues with the barrel aged Mexican, the vanilla, the most recent vanilla, and the reserve. Both released at the same time. Bama was the year before that. So it was kind of tough because we starting out with our coconut vanilla releases of June of 2016, no issues, very, very small bottling line, significant adjunct additions, kind of like what we've been doing, but no issues. And so we had really no cause for alarm until the Bama infection. And even that one, we had actually traced it back to the bottling line that we had been using that was the most likely culprit. And then because we've been testing barrels, we've been testing adjuncts, mostly with plating. We hadn't done any PCR testing at that point. And
to back up for folks that don't understand what we're saying about that, plating, you're using media, growth media that will grow beer spoilers, typically lactobacillus.
Yeah, PDO, usually lactic acid bacteria for the most part. And then, of course, there's
and so you take a sample of that beer, you streak it across the plate. If stuff grows, then you try to isolate the colonies, figure out what it is,
right? And know if it's going to because even if it grows, you may not end up with something that's going to develop any off flavors over time. The known beer spoilers most likely will, and we were finding that most of those were all plating clean, and so we even had independent tests being done to plate them and found those were clean, and then to have issues in the bottle after the fact was that was tough because we had basically taken more precautions even after the Bama issues we had, took more precautions in our barrel program, dumped more barrels that we either tested or knew were off. pH was a good indicator for us as well before we go and spend the money on plating. And so with both reserve and vanilla, we traced them back to the adjuncts, which was even more unfortunate because we have both records on everything we did since then, and even plating those same barrels after the fact. They've all either PCR'd or plated. Well, after they plated clean, they PCR'd clean. So we know it was from the adjuncts.
So when we say PCR, polymerase chain reaction testing,
right.
And this is basically it's DNA testing.
Yep, it just tells you. It tells you if either, and they'll usually do two separate tests: one for wild yeast, and then one assay for wild yeast, one assay for lactic acid bacteria in particular. And I'm not sure how many different strains it's looking for, but it'll tell you total quantity.
It kind of depends on who the test provider is.
It's in, I guess, cells per milliliter, and it'll tell you exactly what your count is on potential either lactic acid or wild yeast. So you'll know it's a known beer spoiler, but
sure.
But then
there's still limitations on PCR,
for sure.
And some of the limitations are, any of the cost-effective PCR solutions out there on the market are going to test for still a relatively limited number of these potential spoilers. Some of the most popular spoilers, and there are still other spoilers out there that are just small-time folks that where you're just not going to test for those because it's such a low likelihood of that happening. The other issue with PCR is that because it's testing for DNA, it catches both live and dead.
Right.
And so, you have to make a decision, you have to figure out, is this stuff actually alive in this beer? Did the alcohol kill it all off already? And yet it's still floating around in there. I mean, there's certainly some challenges, and there's no necessarily perfect way in any cost-effective sense to test this stuff.
Especially not for a small brewery. I mean, we're relying on other breweries and other labs to do our PCR testing. We don't have an in-house PCR yet. We looked into it, but it's so expensive, and also not only that, the running the test is expensive. Having someone that we can have full time being able to run that, the media is expensive. It's a very costly, but it's also a little bit more definitive than plating. We found, not absolutely definitive, but like you said,
you say complementary.
Complementary for sure. I think. I mean, we still do both. But PCR for us at least tells us, okay, what's our risk factor before moving to the next step, whether it's going from the barrel to the bright, whether it's going from the barrel onto adjuncts, whether it's going from the bright into the bottles or going from bottles to consumers. So we're, that's where we've shifted our focus now instead of just...
Even, also the other challenge, and I should have mentioned this before, the other thing with PCR is that there are certain thresholds.
For sure.
And with all kinds of testing, there are thresholds under which you will not observe, a positive test. And theoretically, that threshold is set at a point where, if that potential spoiler is below that threshold, it can't get a foothold. But crazy things can happen at the same time.
Certainly not impossible.
It's not impossible. We're talking about 97, 98% likelihood. We're not ever talking about 100% likelihood in some of this testing.
Even after pasteurization, that's the other. It's all risk management at this point because you have so many opportunities for failure, whether it's in the barrels or whether it's with the adjuncts or in the bottles, in any environment, not just a small brewery, but any brewery of any size with any, whether they have mixed cultures or not, and even just a clean production facility. Obviously, we have sour barrels stored in our tap room, which are separate from our clean barrels that we're here sitting in right now. We're in the barrel. We're recording in the barrel room, so we're here looking at all the Medianoche barrels and talking about infection. It's making them very uneasy.
Oh gosh, sorry guys.
But yeah, they're kind of looking down at us right now.
But you have split out your sour barrels.
We have. But then again, that's another. It's not a definitive protection, but it's one more step, one more variable we can do to reduce the instances. The good news is that since now we've essentially just put all the brakes on packaging Medianoche until we come up with a better recourse and really even the adjuncting, it may just become that we can't adjunct at 45 to 50 pounds of toasted coconut in a 1.5 barrel batch or those kinds of things. We might just have to say those are draft only.
Have to be subtle and balanced about it, Neil.
Or maybe just only package the non-adjunct versions. I think we love making these ridiculously adjunct heavy laden with this big barrel character. We like complementing those two together, but the classic, out of all the bottles we've done lately, Medianoche, the non-adjunct is the only one we haven't had issues with. So that's the good news, is that we know
And you've tested it recently and
we
gone
have,
back.
yeah.
Okay.
We've done multiple tests. We've actually sent it down, I think, now 4 different times, and we've done other tests with other beers. And
Yeah.
so yeah, that one, like I said, there's nothing definitive. I can't say 100%. No one's going to experience issues with their bottles, but I can also say systematically, not everyone will. I can say that probably with fairly high certainty. Whereas the other beers, it's almost it's a crapshoot. Some of the vanilla, especially, have come back clean. Some have not, and so now it's a guess. Reserve was probably more majority, and that was mostly from the coconut. And we've learned since then. We've actually tested other coconut. We actually have a coconut coffee Medianoche draft only going on the tap tomorrow. Yep, Jamie's got a sample of that. And this was actually mostly a stability test batch. I mean, we wanted to complement the flavors. We had this is 19 months in the Woodford Rye Whiskey Barrel, so it's our oldest batch we've actually put out to the public. So 19 months in Woodford Rye, and then we added 25. This is a single barrel, so a single bourbon barrel after 19 months, probably only 45 gallons or less. So we did 50 pounds, 25 pounds of toasted coconut. We sourced from a different coconut supplier than we did on our reserve, and it was pre-toasted. That was the other difference. We toasted the other one with a commissary kitchen for reserve. This one we bought toasted from the supplier, and we also added 5 pounds of coffee from our local coffee supplier here, Zoe's. So we PCR'd that at every stage of the process: barrel, into the bright, with the adjuncts, and then into the keg, and it's all clean. So that was mainly for us to see what are some options for us for coconut that is not necessarily going to have the high risk factor we had with the reserve. And then we're going to do the same with vanilla, and we're working on different vanilla sources. Price is one thing, but stability is a bigger concern. So we'll spend more on vanilla we know is good versus taking a risk on some vanilla that's flavor-wise might be similar, but could have a lot more vulnerability as far as microstability.
Sure.
So we're doing a lot of those tests now to see what adjuncts are safe and which suppliers can we trust. Because once you put the adjuncts in, there's really not, there's no turning back. So it's going into the beer. It's whether or not that beer goes to the public or leaves the tap room. That's the other alternative.
I think that's an interesting piece that that folks may not have as much understanding about as they probably should. That what we're talking about in terms of infection developing is being able to be confident in the beer, even when it's warm stored and on the bottom shelf, in somebody's basement, versus being able to as you serve it out of the tap room, being able to keep it at 34, 36 degrees consistently. There is a temperature factor that does inhibit the growth of a lot of these beer spoiler lactic acid bacteria.
For sure.
And so if you keep it in your cooler, even if it does have some signs of infection, you can make sure that it's never going to be experienced in that way. When we say infection, like, this is not something that's going to make you sick.
No,
like, this stuff is all perfully healthy in terms of food safety.
It's not going to make your
you consume these same things in
Right.
sour beer all the time.
Yep.
We use the term infection, but it's really kind of a misnomer because it's not going to
flavor development.
Right. It's just unintentional flavors there. Right. And if you store that in your cooler, and even if some of those things are there, you can make sure that those off flavors aren't expressing themselves, and you can be confident in the beer that you're serving to people out of your tap room. When you package that, you have to have an extra level of confidence in that it can actually sit in a bottle and be good over any time frame that you want to guarantee your consumers, whether that's 3 months or 6 months or 4 years for that matter.
Yeah, and I think that's the hard part too. As a consumer, you can't fault a consumer for wanting to be able to sell her a beer they spent $25, $30, $45, $55 a bottle on. So there's not that. I certainly understand like that. Like, I don't want to have to drink this within 3 weeks. I didn't spend $55 on a bottle that I have to drink right away. I want to save it for an occasion. So I understand that for sure. I mean, from the brewery's
that $55 bottle of vanilla that I bought, you may see a replacement claim for me on that.
Did you open it yet or not yet?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, we have. I
had to because
you have to get your
for
claim
science,
in.
right?
But we have we had a lot of people wanting to sit on those bottles, which I understand. I mean, from a flavor perspective, they're probably not going to improve, but you're waiting for the occasion. So if you're cellaring for an occasion, that makes sense. If you're cellaring for change, it's not likely you're going to see a lot of improvement. I mean, especially after 19 months in a barrel or 18 months or 17 months, that beer, even on the adjuncts, we're using so much coconut and vanilla. to keep that beer as, that those flavors as prominent as possible in months, they're 2 months, they're going to fade off. What shouldn't happen is obviously that the flavor should change. It's just, or should develop new flavors. It should just maybe mellow out on some of the adjuncts. So, cellaring, I think, is just the nature of anyone buying these bottles. I think, like you said, it's just figuring out when.
On that subject, what I love about the folks that cellar these days, or they get a beer like, oh, it's so hot right now, we need to wait a year on this. At the same time, body is such an important thing, in big stouts these days, and that's the first thing to go.
For sure.
As time marches on in these beers. The first thing that happens, is that body starts thinning out.
Yeah, you see some changing.
And so
there.
you would expect that folks that really understood how these beers change over time, if body matters that much to you, drink it fresh.
Right. Yeah, especially a barrel aged beer that's maybe even non-adjuncted. It's been 17 months in the barrel. I mean, you're going to want to see how it changes, but it's not going to improve. It's going to change, but it's not going to get better. It's not going to magically. So, I think that's always the tough part, is that managing consumer expectation. Like if you don't like this beer now fresh, you probably shouldn't buy a bottle. But the infections are a whole separate discussion. So I think moving forward, we're pretty much now at the point. I mean, there's no way we can put out a bottle that's definitively not going to go bad. There's no way to do that 100%. It just means that we can ensure we've done everything we can at this point, even using resources we don't have on site, to ensure that those bottles have the least likely, lowest likelihood of changing or developing off flavors. So that's, for us right now, it's relying mostly on PCR at multiple stages and plating, so combination of the two. But like you said, that's not even 100% because of those are both selecting for known beer spoilers. So, I know that others have found new beer spoilers from those processes.
We say known beer spoilers, but the spoiler that killed Bourbon County 2015
was not on those assays.
It was not on any of those assays. It was something that even with the best intentions, you weren't going to find this strange lactobacillus strain that originated or was originally found in sake.
I think it was a 12 or 13 day. Plating, like it wouldn't show up on plates for more than almost 2 weeks, which is fairly unheard of. And I mean, any lab you send that to is going to tell you, yeah, this beer plate's clean, but it's you're not waiting 2 weeks, you're waiting three days.
I look at this almost like an arms race. Brewers are doing things that they've never done before in the history of beer. We're brewing bigger beers. We're adding more and more things to those big beers. That historical logic of if it's this big and this much alcohol, nothing can live in it, made sense for a while. But we're talking about living organisms here, and natural selection happens. Things grow and change, and if you you can think that you've created an environment where those things can't live and thrive, and yet, life finds a way.
Oh, for sure.
These organisms are finding ways, and they're naturally selecting themselves out to be able to survive and thrive in some of these environments that they've never been able to before. And so, in some ways, this is just something that the brewing industry has to stay vigilant on, and keep looking for and keep developing new ways, because for every good defense that the brewing industry comes up with, a lot of these organisms, they're gonna find their own offensive way to continue to grow and thrive.
Yeah, I think every brewery just needs to figure out where their risk threshold is, and we were on a much higher risk than your average barrel program, because we just are brewing massive beer, not just in gravity, or not just in alcohol, but also in gravity. I mean, we've shifted Medianoche to even a little bit higher gravity, even though it's not fermenting that, it's not attenuating much further. It's just more body. It's more residual sweetness to last 18 months in the barrel, versus when we originally designed the recipe, it was meant for 12 months. So, our average length in the barrel, we're just basically saying, give it as long as it needs. And if it needs 20 months, it needs 20 months. If it needs 10 months, it needs 10 months. But there's a very big difference in how that beer changes from 10 months to 20 months. So you have to factor that into your recipe. So our starting gravity on Medianoche is close to 33, 34 Plato now, which means it finishes at anywhere from 10 to even as high as 15 Plato. It's a lot of extra sugar sitting around in these barrels for 18, 19 months that any critter would love to just, whether it's lactic acid bacteria or even wild yeast, it's a lot of sugar that's not pasteurized. There's a lot of risk. So we just have figured out what's the way we can mitigate our risk as much as possible. But really the best way would be to make it, finish a lot lower and cut a lot of sweetness, but we know it's going to make a different beer. So, for us, it just means we're always going to be kind of running on the higher end of risk, but we either need to figure out a different process for packaging it, whether it means, even pasteurizing is not going to be the final solution. That might be something we look into down the road if we're a little bit bigger. It's like one more step, but if it's at the cost of flavor, if we have any flavor degradation, especially in our adjunct stouts, probably won't opt for that either. So I think every brewer just needs to evaluate what's our model, what's our goal. For us, it's making just a beer that challenges even a style as established as barrel aged stouts. Like, we've been influenced by some of the best, but we also can see, like, I feel like there's a lot of room for expressing more barrel character, but with that you need more balance from the base beer. And I think it was really interesting to see the GABF results this year. This is the first time I've seen two of the biggest, I think, Maman and Medianoche, I think, are two of the bigger, as far as body goes and just sweetness, bigger barrel aged stouts available that, to win a medal or to win the gold and silver. I think it says a lot about the judges too, how they're changing, because a lot of times our, especially classic brewers, hated most about those beers. They're just too big. They're either too boozy, too barrel, too much sweetness, too much whatever. And I think the combination of both the bigger body and more sweetness, a little bit more alcohol, and more time in the barrel kind of balances those out. So there's still balance to those, but you can't do that. You can't put a beer that finishes at 7 Plato or even 6 Plato. You can't put that in a barrel for 25 months and expect there to still be base beer left. There's got to be something to hold up to all that extraction, all that time in oak, even some oxidation. That's the other thing, is we get a lot of oxidation over 20 months or so.
Yeah.
So all those things, all that's to say that we run a high risk. It's a high risk barrel program. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. And then on top of that, when we take these massively sweet finishing gravity beers, high finishing gravity beers, and then throw, how many ever pounds per barrel of vanilla or coconut or whatever it is into the tank before we package it, it's another area that we add more risk. But it also means we're not going to abandon that. We're just going to figure out either, one, we can't package it as we intended, and so we have to figure out a different way to deliver it to, hopefully, people just drink it on draft, or
So that's why you put those on tap in your tap room instead of packaging.
The plan was, if we have a barrel that basically, if we hit at any point in the process, we could still serve the beer. Fortunately, since we started testing, we've had the opposite problem. We keep testing these adjuncts and they're all coming back clean. I wish we had packaged that beer, but it's still fun to put them on draft. But that's the other option, is that, if you have a hit, just because you bottled it doesn't mean that has to all go down the drain. There's a lot of potential. Like you said, we have cases of Medianoche Reserve in the cold room that have been there the whole time, still drink fantastic. So every once in a while, we'll put them out on the list, and they're on premise only. And I think that's a great option too for brewers that are going to have an issue with that. It's not just, I have to eat the cost of whatever, a couple thousand, probably close to $20,000 worth of beer, that if you're already packaged and then you have a hit, let's say you have an issue on the bottling day, which is, a high culprit for us as well on the vanilla. That was our very first run on our Maheen. So that vanilla reserve were both packaged on the same day. So we know for sure the numbers are different. So there's a different level of basically lactic acid bacteria in both those bottles. So we could say it was the bottling day, but that doesn't really account for the discrepancy between the two. That's where the coconut, I think, comes into play, and maybe even the vanilla. We've had some vanilla tests, just straight vanilla tinctures we've done to test to see if our vanilla is clean, and had some issues there too. But
I think it was all those floating chunks of coconut.
Could be the extra coconut.
It just gave all that lactic acid bacteria.
There's no question we use a lot of real coconut, but we ran a higher risk. So I think moving forward, we're just going to wait until we are absolutely confident, as much as we can now with even more resources. We've said that before, so I understand people's hesitations, but we're, with all the resources we have available, and really the resources the industry has, we're using basically the same metrics that almost any large brewery would, minus pasteurization. That's the only thing we're not utilizing. With that much confidence, we'll put beer out in bottles to the public, but until we're confident that, it'll either not get released, or it'll stay in the tap room until we're sure about it, or we'll come up with other solutions.
Another option, might be if you're packaging to limit your risk on that with a guaranteed until, or a time limit, a drink before, because with some of these beers, it seems like longer time in the bottle has led to more of this problem, and certainly people's storage, the way they store it. That's up to them. It's packaged beer; they should be able to store it the way they want to, even if those conditions do impact the way that those things develop. But if you put a 3-month or a 6-month time limit on it, and that's your guarantee, is that something you've considered?
Yeah, I think if, let's say, for example, our next adjunct, we do a couple 100 bottles and they end up hitting on PCR later after they've sat for a bit in the bottles, and we have a hit, whatever, in the process. I think we could have a very feasible option of saying, hey, this beer is likely not changing in 70 days. We'll charge a certain price for it, which will obviously be discounted, but you got to drink it, and there's no guarantee. After that point, it's your own risk. We'll probably, I'm guessing we won't go that route. It's for us. Even talking to Corey King up at Big Beers this year, he had a really good point that if you put it out in the bottle, or put it in the bottle and put it out to the public, it's really on the brewery to make sure that it's ready to sit in the harshest environment that you can imagine. Which I totally agree with him. It shouldn't be the consumer.
A lot of his stouts are just sold straight over the bar at his brewery.
And a lot of them are, I think, and a lot of that's even just the demand trying to curb a little bit of the secondary, just to make sure it gets into the hands of the people that want to drink it. But if you put any beer into a bottle, there's going to be the tendency is going to be to store it. So, even putting it in a crowler, there was a little different, a different way people treated those. They didn't treat them as something you should put on your shelf at 65 degrees or 60 degrees even, or even 50 degrees. They put them in the fridge.
Right.
So, I think that's another option for us is just, hey, this is a draft only that we're putting in a crowler again. And, there's no guarantee on it. Just drink it. It's good right now. But I think we're leaning more towards
to start crowling your barrel aged stouts again.
Crowlers. 32 ounces of Medi Noche. No, I think the most likely for us is just to if we put it in a bottle and we release it across the bar, if it walks out of the tap room, you should be able to hold on to it. So, up until now, we've basically guaranteed that, and if it doesn't happen, then we'll replace it. With Bama, we did a refund because we didn't have anything coming out for almost 18 months, I guess. Or 14 months, I guess, from that release. And so for us moving forward now, it's if it leaves the tap room, we need to do everything we can to make sure it passes all that. But it doesn't mean we'll probably take a little bit of a longer break just to make sure we have everything dialed in before we put another bottle out to the public.
Fair enough. I don't want to end on that subject, so let's talk about something a little more fun.
Yeah.
You've started dabbling in Pilsners. I shouldn't say dabble. You've won a bronze World Beer Cup award for a Vienna lager, and as of late, you brewed a Keller Mexican lager, and now have a Keller Pilsner on tap. Where'd the lager thing come from, and what's driven your excitement in that? Here you are known for hazy IPAs and big barrel-aged beers and pastry stouts, but are these just labors of love, or do you see real legs to the whole lager approach for craft brewers?
As much as I want 2018 to be the year that lager is just like the go-to SKU or brand for everyone, I don't know that the consumers are moving that quickly towards it. Obviously, Pilsner is probably the most popular style amongst brewers. Any brewer anywhere in the world, I think, no matter what festival you're at, no matter what group you're at, you're always looking for the pretty well executed Pilsner. But I think mostly for us, it's about what our brewers want to drink during their shift or what they want to take home and drink. Not that there's fatigue, but I think at some point you can only drink so many really massively, almost aggressively or irresponsibly hopped IPAs or adjunct stouts or all those things. Everybody wants a beer you can just drink no matter what, whether it's with dinner or with nothing. You just want to drink it after your shift, or if you want to drink it before bed. Like, there needs to be something that can you don't need an occasion just to drink this beer, and I think that's where lager comes in for me. Vienna lager, I love the style. Negro Modelo, and even Dos Equis Amber were really the most popular Vienna lagers in the U.S. for a long time, because the Austrians, the Vienna lagers were, they had all migrated and stopped making it. I think the rise of German lager really curbed what was happening in Austria, and so our best examples were the Mexican Vienna lagers for a long time. So I was really
Sam Adams,
and then since then, since the American brewing, I think Sam Adams Boston Lager was the best American version. But even that, I think, strayed even more than say Dos Equis or Negro Modelo, which even strayed a lot from Austrian roots of that style. And so I love that style a lot. And so when we were talking about doing something different here, was it, I guess, almost 2 years ago, it was just a style that I didn't see a lot on the shelf. And hey, let's just try our own take on it. Ours is a bit, Puesta del Sol was a bit more of a halfway point between the Mexican drier, kind of crisper versions and a bit more the malt-focused Austrian versions. It was kind of right halfway in between. And then to win a World Beer Cup bronze with it in the Vienna category was really neat, especially because that was our first batch that we brewed. My first lager, actually, because I didn't have
that was the first lager you brewed.
First lager.
And you won a World Beer Cup medal for it.
Yeah. So, but then we haven't won since then with that. So, I can only enter styles the first time I make them, and after that they lose all their luck. But it was.
We're gonna see a field beer from you this year.
Maybe field beer. I didn't have any fermentation control at home, so I couldn't do lagers at home. Sure. But I've always loved the idea of giving a beer more time without, and that's from a production perspective, it's a terrible decision for us because it takes longer than almost every beer and it sells for way less. We can't charge the same. We can't give it the tank premium that we do on IPAs. But I think we're just committed to making styles we love, and that I think fits that ethos for us. So it's Keller Pills. We'll probably do a more kind of summery pills this summer. We'll probably even bring in some other kind of medium to darker lagers, maybe Box down the road, or our production team. I think the Keller Pills and the Grisette are probably the two favorite beers we've done in the last 2 months, just because it's something that you can drink, into the day, maybe even at lunch, and not be totally, either palate wrecked from, even our minor bitterness. But I think those are the beers you brew for you, not necessarily for the customers. If customers like them, then great. But that's kind of when we're willing to justify slower sales. I mean, the Keller Pills and the Grisette are probably our two slowest moving beers we've done in the last 3 or 4 months. And it's just not where the consumers are, and it's also not our niche. So, it's one thing for another brewery to make them and do well, but nobody knows WeldWerks for lagers. So it's not. I'm not completely dumbfounded by the fact that we won't sell through a ton of Grisette or Keller Pills or even some of the other classic styles we do. It's just not what people know us for. But we also want to give people a sense that we're not a one-trick pony. We don't just make barrel-aged stouts or New England style IPAs or pastry stouts. Or now I guess we have a lot of, or a wheat beer that we win a medal with. We can do other things too.
There you go.
Yeah.
Well, fantastic. Neil, thank you so much for joining me on this episode of the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
This episode has been brought to you by craftbeer.com, home of the most mouth-watering map in the world, the map of U.S. breweries. If you find yourself in a new city and want to sample the local flavors, or if you just want to marvel at the vast American beer landscape, visit craftbeer.com. I imagine that map, if you were to search for Greeley, would lead you to WeldWerks and Wiley Roots and a couple of others. So if you do check out that map, make sure to put Greeley on your own personal map. Neil, thanks so much for talking with us.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks. And if you want to learn more, Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine can be found on the web at beerandbrewing.com. We'd love for you to subscribe to the podcast. We'd love even more if you subscribe to the magazine. And if you do so, from time to time, you'll get to read articles written by my guest here, Neil Fisher from WeldWerks Brewing. Thanks so much, Neil.
Thank you.
This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.